Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, which is the traditional way of opening these live virtual roundtables. Thank you all for joining us and listening, and thank you to our panelists. We are waiting on a couple to be joining us, but we thought we would kickstart and begin the discussion. Earlier on, David Marsh, my colleague, spoke with esteemed panelists talking about a lot about the fiscal and inflationary questions on the growth in the euro area. At the end, they discussed the key conversations will be around the greenification of monetary policy. And while we are exiting and growing from following the COVID-19 crisis, how central banks and also the fiscal policies help support the green finance agenda. And the transition to net zero. So I'm very pleased to say that this session will be looking at the central banking practices and toolkits. We'll also be touching on how central banks are communicating with citizens. And I'm very pleased to welcome Carlos Thomas. He's head of the Macro Financial Analyst and Monetary Policy Department at Banco de España. We have Giuseppe Ferrero, Deputy Head Monetary Policy Analyst Division, Bank d'Italia. And we have Morgan Dupree, who is the Director of Strategy in the new Strategy Department of Bank de France. So we'll be hearing all about the new Strategy Division of Bank de France and what their focus is there. He also has the NGFS banner behind him. So we will be touching on greenification of central banks there as well. So we will touch on your previous role, which I'm sure feeds into your current one quite a lot. So first of all, I want to ask Carlos to talk to us about how the ECB and also the central banking community has responded to the pandemic, the monetary policy measures, and also Natasha Vallett is also here. She is the Dean of Sciences Po, School of Management and Innovation in Paris, formerly ECB. We will be coming to her later to also set the scene a little around US, UK versus the ECB on normalization. So first of all, back to Carlos, who will be giving us an overview of the ECB strategy on the pandemic. So please, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Good morning, well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me first start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. So the session's title is Central Bank Practices and Toolkits. So in this area, I think there are two important recent developments in the case of the euro area. The first is the pandemic crisis and how the ECB responded to it. And the second is the ECB's strategy review, which was announced last July. So I will just make a few remarks on both issues. Now, on the first one, perhaps the most important measure adopted by the ECB to respond to the pandemic was the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, the so-called PEP. If you look at time series of sovereign and corporate bond yields, it's pretty obvious that the PEP was crucial for stopping and reverting the deterioration in financing conditions that was observed at the onset of the pandemic crisis. Now, of course, the sheer size of the initial purchase envelope, which was 750 billion, was important for the program's success, but also important was the program's flexibility in terms of the allocation of purchases, both over time and across jurisdictions. If you want to put it this way, buying when and where most needed. Okay. I think this was an important innovation compared to the long-standing asset purchase program, the so-called APP, which is characterized by a stable pace of purchases over time, and also a cross-country allocation of purchases that follows more closely the capital key allocation criterion. It's difficult, of course, to measure empirically the contribution of flexibility to the effectiveness of the PEP, but together with my Banco de España colleagues, Jim Costain and Galo Nuño, we have actually investigated this issue by developing a term structure model of the euro area, which we calibrate to replicate the impact of the PEP announcement. And we find that the program's flexibility made indeed a sizable contribution to the PEP's impact, especially of course on the use of peripheral jurisdictions. Now, of course, the PEP was not the only measure adopted by the ECB. As you know, another important measure that we can refer to was the improvement in the conditions of the targeted longer-term refinancing operations, the so-called TLTROs, with the aim of preserving bank lending to the real economy during the crisis. For instance, for the first time since TLTROs were launched back in 2014, Euro area banks could obtain Eurosystem funding at a rate below the deposit facility rate, which is the interest on reserves in the Euro area. Provided they met a certain lending benchmark, which was also relaxed actually. So this very favorable pricing explains the massive take-up by banks in these operations during the pandemic. So in sum, I think the ECB's response to the crisis shows the importance for central banks of being flexible and innovative when it comes to addressing situations such as the pandemic crisis. I think this is an important lesson that we can draw for the future. This also allows me to touch very briefly on the issue of the fiscal monetary policy mix. I think what we have seen during the pandemic is an example of implicit coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, with both of them, working in the same direction and nicely complementing and reinforcing each other. Take, for instance, the PEP. The PEP is being instrumental at allowing fiscal authorities, especially national fiscal authorities, to fund their to finance under very favorable conditions their measures of fiscal support for firms and households. Okay, this is without question. But conversely, these fiscal support measures have been crucial also for cushioning the impact of the pandemic on the Euro area economy and also on the inflation outlook, which is also very important for monetary policy and in particular for the ECB. So this complementarity, okay, between fiscal and monetary policy actions is another very useful lesson for future crises. Now let me move quickly to the second topic that I wanted to address, which is the ECB's new monetary policy strategy. Now, given the time constraint, let me just focus on some of the most important aspects. One, of course, is the new price stability objective. As you know, the inflation aim of below but close to 2% has been replaced by a symmetric 2% target. This target is clearly, obviously much more clear, and it also eliminates the perceived asymmetry in the previous one. Another critical issue is also how the new strategy deals with the lower bound on interest rates. This is a limitation on monetary policy that has become more relevant in recent decades, as you know, due to the apparent decline in the equilibrium real interest rate, the so-called natural interest rate. The ECB incorporates this issue in the strategy by establishing the need for especially forceful or persistent monetary policy actions when the economy is close to the lower bound. And also by indicating that this may imply a transitory period in which inflation is moderately above target. Okay, so what does this mean in practice? Well, a first application of this new framework to the ECB's toolkit can be found in the change in its forward guidance last July in order to adapt it to the new strategy. The new forward guidance establishes a clear connection between the expected date for the rate liftoff and the new inflation target by saying that the ECB Governing Council expects ECB rates to remain at their present or lower levels until it sees inflation reaching 2%, that's the new target, well ahead of the end of its projection horizon and durably for the rest of the projection horizon. And it also complements this condition with an additional requirement linked to underlying inflation. But I think this forward guidance should help isolate the ECB's interest rate policy from spikes in inflation that are expected to be transitory. Or in other words, it should avoid premature monetary policy tightening in response to inflationary shocks that are not expected to persist over the medium term. Okay, and I guess we will later debate about the current inflation spike that we are seeing and how we expect it to evolve in the future. And just to conclude, let me address very quickly the climate-related action plan announced by the ECB as part of its strategy review. The plan contains important commitments. Let me just mention one, which is the adoption of environmental information disclosure requirements for private sector assets as a new eligibility criterion or as a basis for a differentiated treatment for collateral and asset purchases. I think this and the other action points in the plan should allow the ECB to play a catalytic role, okay, in the green transformation of the financial system. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Giuseppe, I want to come to you. You sat on the strategy review streams, and so it would be good for you to give some colour on to how the main features of the strategy review will help the ECB fulfil its tasks within what you described in our briefing call as a low interest rate environment. So perhaps that, but also to touch on the monetary policy and toolkits as well, and the flexibility that they have.
Yes, thank you. Let me thank, first of all, the organizer for having me here in this session. So I think to complete the picture that Carlos gave us, I will talk more about the communication channel that the monetary policy and specifically the strategy review has been considering. So the first thing that I would like to say is that while the changes in the toolkits that Carlos described are partly related to the context of the pandemic and partly to the structural factors that he was describing. And one of these is what you said, the low interest rate environment. The changes in the area of monetary policy communication are mostly related to structural changes. And I will come back to this. So, but let me be clear, this is not to say that communication has not played an important role in recent crises. In fact, in situation of high uncertainty, market instability, and low interest rate, communication itself became a tool to increase aggregate demand and to preserve the proper functioning of the monetary policy transmission. Think about the forward guidance which Carlos was talking about for what concern the expansion to the expansionary force of monetary policy, and think about the whatever it takes as an example of a way to counter illiquidity problems in a specific market. So, but communication then is also crucial for preserving or recovering trust of households and firms in central bank. And here I think sometimes we forget it is, but we should always remember that in a world of fiat money, trust in the currency and in who is managing the currency is crucial for the currency itself to perform its full functions. So one of the conclusions reached inside the strategy review is that in order to preserve trust in central bank, communication should be aimed also not only at specialists and technicians, but also to non-expert and in general to wide public. So on this point, I think it is important to understand the challenges when we communicate with a wider public. And there are mostly two challenges. The first one concerns the language. And here it comes in the financial literacy and this aspect. But the second, and I think is even more substantial challenge, has to do with the difficulty of motivating monetary policy decision exclusively in terms of the price stability primary objective. So, and here I go to my experience in the review of the strategy and what it was the listening events that the ECB and the national central banks had. So in these listening events, motivating monetary policy decision in terms of inflation without explaining what they imply in terms of employment, wages, incomes, it's been shown that it is not sufficient to make a general public aware of what monetary policy can do for their everyday lives. And one example is something that we had in a listening event here at the Bank of Italy with the civil society, there was a representative of the Consumer Association that said, quoting in the review of the strategy, let me find it, that he welcomed deflation as an adjustment mechanism that helps to contain the loss of purchasing power of workers. So I think that explaining that deflationary traps are one of the most dangerous phenomena is crucial in order to anchor inflation expectation in a low interest rate environment. And just as it is crucial in the actual situation, for example, to explain why monetary policy reaction to unexpected or undesirable price increases depends, among other factors, on the nature of the shocks affecting the economy. So communication is crucial on this. So, so this is about, let's say, more in general, the communication with the wider public. But then let me say 2 words before concluding also on communication with experts and what are the main implications of the strategy review. So in general, we can say that communication with experts has been more effective than with the general public, even during the most difficult years of the past. And this is particularly true, but it is particularly true for the communication related to the tools. So we have listened Carlos before, for example, to forward guidance. And this is an example where it was quite effective, let's say in financial markets for sure. So we have seen, for example, on the ECB survey of monetary analysts, that it suggests that the forward guidance which links the path of interest rate to the inflation outlook was quite well understood. But we have also to say that there were some aspects of this same forward guidance that probably were not fully understood according to this survey, in particular related to expressions such as a robust convergence could be quite difficult to understand. So my point is, while communication with the technical, let's say with a more strict sector, the financial markets and firms was quite good relating to the tools. However, and this is my final point, I will go back to one point that Carlos made, communication about the definition of price stability has been less effective and may have weakened the anchoring of inflation expectation. And this is probably the main reason why there was this new definition of inflation aim that came out of the strategy review and is now a simple, unambiguous, and symmetric inflation target that we hope will contribute significantly to the improving of the anchoring of inflation expectation and the attainment of the Eurosystem primary objective.
Thank you very much. I was going to come to Lucio, and I'll come very pleased for you to join us, Lucio Pench, Director Fiscal Policies at DG Econ and Finance in the European Commission. I'm going to actually go to Morgan first and to talk around the strategy that Banque de France is having, especially because I know that you have your own Banque de France Listens work stream currently. So we'll come there. And then I want to go to Lucio to talk about the interplay of monetary policy and fiscal policy as well. So Morgan first, please.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm very happy to be here and to take part in this panel. First of all, I think Carlos and Giuseppe explained very clearly what the ECB Eurosystem did and how it reacted in the face of a very specific crisis. And what Carlos said about being flexible and innovative is, of course, a key factor of success. What I would like to do today is to give you a few examples of how, in practice, we have tried to incorporate a number of actions that central banks need to do in order to improve the way they reach out to the general public, but also they factor in their strategy a number of considerations within their societies, because of course central banks belong and are completely embedded in their social and political environment. And of course, they need to care about financial stability and economy and monetary policy, but they also need to make sure that they reflect appropriately what is going on in their environment. So I will try to illustrate this by giving you 3 examples drawn out of our strategic plan. Especially, I'm going to develop the action on Banque de France Listens, what we do on climate, and the third point would be about technology. I'll say a few words about CBDC. So first, concerning the issue of communication with the general public, clearly it's a key thing to tackle. Why? Because in many countries, central banks are independent. And the counterparty for that is that there is a clear democratic accountability. And we need to make sure that we explain what we do, that we are properly understood. And in some countries, we observed also that you can hear this feeling coming that some politicians are criticizing the independence of central banks, or saying that with a non-conventional monetary policy, you have some huge distributive effects, and that there is to have more democratic governance in there. So it's definitely key that you are able to explain and to reach out to everyone. And so to do that, we kicked off an operation that we called Banque de France Listens, La Banque de France à votre écoute. And this is an operation that we did throughout the year 2020. First, of course, in person meetings, and then in a hybrid and video conference format. We organized that in all the regions, in 16 French regions, and we covered 200,000 people altogether, including those who listened to the show, I would say, by webcast or replay. And it was extremely, extremely interesting. Our outtake was the following. First, a lot of people don't know what we do. They don't really know what a central bank is. They don't necessarily know what your mandate is about. They have some unclear ideas about what you can and you can't do, but they still have expectations for you. Typically, they would like central banks to take care of climate change, to take care of inequalities. They also believe that we should do more to improve purchasing power of the people. And of course, we can't do that, but we need to explain. And I would say the interest of that event is that first, we collected a lot of thoughts and questions, and then we tried to explain a bit what we could do, what we couldn't do. And here, the key thing that Giuseppe mentioned as well is to be able to speak in a proper and clear language. This is a real challenge because usually central bankers talk to investors, to the market people, and it used to be a science in itself to try to understand what Greenspan was saying, but at some point you have to be quite clear and say things in clear language so that everybody can understand. It has to do, of course, with financial literacy that you also need to develop as much as you can. It's also part of our strategic plan. But still, you need to be able to talk to a variety of people with a variety of knowledge about what you do. And clearly, we believe that sort of action is useful, and we will do that every year now. We will organize every year a new campaign of Banque de France Listens so that we can make sure we explain what we do, and we are able to incorporate also the feedback. Second point on climate change. So as you rightly mentioned, Eli, behind me, I got an NGFS banner because indeed a few months ago, I was in charge of the NGFS Secretariat. And I know I have to move on, but I like it. It's a memory from my colleagues. So on climate change, we had a discussion yesterday, Eli, and you said that central banks were expanding their mandate. And I said, no, they're not expanding their mandate. They're fulfilling their mandate. And here, what I meant was that within the NGFS, we found out a way to frame the question in a way that was understandable to all central banks, because we were not trying to make the topic political. We were simply saying climate change is a source of financial risk, and all central banks and supervisors almost all central banks have a financial stability mandate. So if you're not taking care of climate risk in your policies, then you're not fulfilling your mandate properly. And once we framed the question this way, immediately we got traction. And a very large number of NCBs and supervisors started to join because they realized that it's simply not political. It's a matter of risk, and we need to take care of risk. This is within our mandate. And typically within Banque de France, of course, we do take care of the NGFS Secretariat, but we also want to incorporate this risk in a very holistic manner, I would say, throughout our various activities, risk, investment, monetary policy, supervision. And we get back to that later, I guess, but concerning the greenification of monetary policy, it's also about being consistent. If you tell your banks, look, climate change is a source of financial risk, you need to put in place proper practices to prevent and mitigate that risk, and you're not doing anything on your own portfolio, then you're not credible. So yeah, you have to go through all the chain and also make sure that you cover and you take care of climate risk in your various activities. This is what we try to do within our strategic plan. And maybe last point I would like to make without being too long, it's on technology. Clearly, we have the feeling that we are in an environment that is extremely potentially disruptive for us, for central banks. Of course, the elephant in the room is this issue of crypto assets and CBDC. We know it's a big thing. We know it's a big factor of disruption. And we know that potentially it may considerably impact the way we operate in our missions and our operations, even though we don't really know yet how, when, but we know there's something that we need to investigate. And for that reason as well, working on the CBDC topic, taking part in the Eurosystem experimentation phase is also a key part of our strategic priorities. And with that, I'm done with my first point.
Thank you. And I think that what we've heard, Lucio, has been quite interesting and definitely links with the work that you're doing at the European Commission, especially around net zero, factoring climate change, the digital disruption. And so it would be interesting to hear from you the thinking from the perspective that you, reflections from what you've heard in the last sort of 20 minutes, and also the work that you're doing at the European Commission around the growth in Europe and the fiscal and monetary policy interplay. I won't use the word coordination, but interplay with each other in the growth agenda.
Many thanks for inviting me. Indeed, many very interesting issues have been raised. Because of my position and my background, I feel more comfortable to elaborate briefly on the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy in an environment of persistently low interest rate.
Perfect.
And I will cover essentially 3 points. First, just highlight why this complementarity. There is a strategic complementarity with the two policies when you are in such an environment. Something has already been said in this respect. Then I will try to give an illustration. And again, we also heard, especially in the first intervention, consideration in this sense of how this strategic complementarity has been at play in the COVID crisis. And third point, possibly more interesting, to draw some implication for policy framework going forward in the light of the review of monetary policy that the ECB has just completed and the ongoing review of economic governance here at the European Commission. So the first point is already been broached by other presenters. We know that in an environment of low interest, persistently low interest rate, monetary policy is more likely to hit the so-called effective lower bound. In turn, this means that monetary policy may be less effective. It can turn to other instruments, but this instrument may be less effective in terms of stimulating the economy and also carrying also a number of collateral undesirable effects. This calls for a bigger role for fiscal stabilization, fiscal policy. But second, the unconventional instrument has also typically an effect of operating by flattening the yield curve. So they have more of an impact of fiscal space. So fiscal stabilization comes at a lower cost. So here is a bit the two terms of the strategic complementarity. This was very much at play, we can say, and something has already been said, with the COVID crisis. This mutually reinforces effect. We could see it. On the one hand, by facilitating, maintaining favorable financial conditions and preserving financial stability, the monetary policy has certainly strongly contributed to a more effective transmission of fiscal policy support. At the same time, one should also remember that, and I think this perhaps is the most interesting part, that government intervention through the euro area have helped reduce the risk of an impairment of the transmission of monetary policy. Here I'm speaking in particular of the measure supporting household income and providing liquidity support to firms, which have facilitated the provision of credit to the economy, essentially has facilitated an efficient pass-through of the financing condition to all the economy. So here you see the complementarity at work. Now, perhaps the most interesting part is, or the most interesting question in what all these imply for a policy framework going forward. I mean, assuming that this low interest rate environment is going to stay. What does this mean? Well, it means that the effective lower bound is also likely to stay at least as an intermittent constraint. The implication for the monetary policy framework have already been made quite explicit because we have the review of the ECB, and there I would just draw attention to at least 2 points in the main conclusion of the monetary policy review. One point, as already made before, is the asymmetric reaction function in the vicinity of the lower bound. So, in the word of the ECB, more forceful and persistent reaction will, in case of adverse large shock. At the same time, and this is really a novelty, if one compares, have been around for some time, and I think is almost a revolution if you think, and David Marsh has been around for even longer time than I have, if one thinks of the philosophy of the ECB, not to speak of the Bundesbank, a very explicit recognition of the role of fiscal policy, again, in condition in which the effective lower bound will be an intermittent constraint. In other words, monetary policy reaction may not be enough. And here I come perhaps to the point that is closer to my realm of activity. What are the implications for the EU fiscal framework, which we know for a number of reasons that I don't have time to go into, is and is likely to remain to some extent a rule-based fiscal framework. Because an implication is that the reaction of the automatic stabilizer may not be enough at the zero lower bound. So a more forceful reaction also on the part of fiscal policy may be needed through the deployment of discretionary fiscal policy. So a first consideration that let's say I would very tentatively draw, I mean, without, of course, committing my institution, is that we may see in the future more recourse to the general escape clause that are built into our fiscal framework, but were meant originally, I drafted actually the text of the general escape clause for a very extreme scenario. One may even think, but here I'm thinking aloud, of a possible involvement of the ECB in the triggering of the escape clause, to the extent that the fact that the effective lower bound is binding is something that the central bank is best placed to certify. But there is also another element, and here I conclude. What about the fiscal framework outside of the effective lower bound? Because otherwise we risk to produce a dangerous asymmetry whereby when the crisis situation hits, both monetary and fiscal policy, I mean, have to go the full Monty, so to speak. But in fiscal terms, this also probably imply a ratcheting up of public debt, and we may reach at some point some limits. I think that the answer of this would be an enhanced medium-term orientation of fiscal policy. And I think there is much to be said in favor of that. The real difficult question, and is something to which also the review of economic governance should try to give a better answer, is what are the instruments that you can deploy, and here the problem is as much political as economics, to obtain this medium-term orientation, which stabilize the expectation of agents on the sustainability of fiscal policy. And here I think the question is that of the right balance between a possibly increased reliance on national medium-term framework institution and the necessity of interference at the EU level. And I will leave it here because this is a question that I believe is still open. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. There is a lot to unpack there. We also have a few questions coming in already from the audience, so please do keep them coming. I'm going to turn to Natasha to close this opening remarks, which have been very comprehensive. So thank you for that. And I have a few questions to pick up on each of the panelists. But Natasha, please do give your thoughts on what's just been said. And also, I mean, the key question is this inflation transitory, and how do we react to that as well?
Thank you very much, Ellie, for giving the word. I'll be short because the discussion has been very rich already. And I think it was very interesting to get those views. The combination is interesting in itself because we are still in a phase where we are doing the exegesis of the strategy review. So the strategy review is new enough, has not been really tested, and it's being tested in real time at a time when the questions about some kind of normalization is going to take place, at a time when the Federal Reserve, which had reviewed its strategy a while earlier, is implementing its monetary policy within this new strategy. So I think this gives a very interesting perspective. I think what's behind it in like light words is first the question of sequencing of tools for the normalization of monetary policy. And now the current developments are really happening at a relatively high pace. You know, the Bank of England has changed its way to communicate about inflation. I think was it Morgan? Did you speak about the communication about inflation, or Giuseppe? I don't remember.
Giuseppe, I think, did that.
Giuseppe did. And I think this is very, very crucial. I mean, it's always been very crucial to have the right measures for inflation expectations, and inflation expectations have always been at the center of central banks' analysis, the analysis being forward-looking. But now it's all the more crucial because we have this uncertainty, and because no economist today is able to tell you where the uncertainty is going to evolve. I think at the Monetary Policy Symposium of the ECB, 10 days ago, there was a very interesting paper by Francesco Lippi, who was looking at this and saying, you know, persistence is also endogenous. You have to look at how you know, expectations evolve, and this endogeneity sort of, I'm not saying we are all getting back to monetarism, but this sound endogeneity of the evolution of inflation developments and inflation expectations to policy signals is coming back at the center of the thinking of central banking. And I think that's a very good thing. And it's a very good thing because we were, and that's my second remark, I think we're transiting from an environment in which we thought we didn't know anything anymore about the Phillips curve, about the process behind inflation, about the supply and demand phenomena behind the price formation mechanism. And now we may be finding that some things work, you know, again, about communication, what are the shocks behind the inflation process? Supply shock, demand shock, transitory shock, or structural shock. And when you look at it in a structured manner, you can have a rationalized policy response. So I think that that's one key message that I would bring from the discussion today, but also from comparing the various positions, and that I will close on this, but the various positions of what the Fed is doing, the Bank of England is doing, and the ECB is doing, or not doing yet, but more slowly preparing into doing in terms of mapping those central objectives and central mandate metrics into policy reaction. Now, I think the Bank of England has been pretty clear about its view on the persistence of inflation, the inflation process. The Fed is walking the talk in a sense, and I think that's I mean, it's not the topic of today, but that's interesting to see. But now it's very much open for the ECB now and the Eurosystem to see how we will get back to. And I'm looping that back to the strategy review in the new strategic context where forward guidance has a key role, where the relative role of each instrument has been restated. You know, the role of interest rates down the line will still be central. We will need flexible instruments around it in the permanent toolkit. It's very much open yet how this will play out in the coming month. And I think. And I would link that back to the discussions that were seen in the central banking symposium in the US Jackson Hole. Christine Forbes had this nice set of slides, very agnostically saying, but you know, you can really decouple all instruments. It works under very different states of the world. So you can adjust forward guidance. You can start by adjusting rates and not doing anything. I mean, after a while of tapering, of course, but not doing much in terms of adjusting the central bank balance sheet size. And all those, I think the ECB, I would love to think that the ECB is agnostic about it and is looking into this in a very flexible manner at the moment, because by gaining time and waiting before engaging more forcefully in the interpretation of inflation, in the interpretation of conjunctural developments and taking consequences on monetary policy implementation, then I think this time can be very usefully used to compare all those options in an agnostic way. So I'll stop here.
We have a related question from Krishna Guna, who has asked, and I want to put this to Carlos first and then Giuseppe afterwards. The PEPP was remarkably effective because of its flexibility to front-load purchases and deviate from capital key as required to maintain favorable financing conditions in all jurisdictions. To what degree is it plausible and desirable to maintain some of this flexibility in the post-PEP world? So if we are moving towards other QE forms and transitioning away from PEP, will this flexibility be part of that? Carlos, what are your thoughts here? And then Giuseppe, I'll come to you.
Okay, that's a great question, and it's one of the questions, the kind of questions where the usual disclaimer applies. These are my opinions,
of course,
not necessarily those of the ECB Eurosystems. My own view is that I mean, as I said before, one of the main lessons from the crisis was that flexibility in asset purchases is very useful. So going forward, I think at least some of that flexibility, some of the flexibility features that were incorporated in PEP should also be transferred to the APP or to some other new hypothetical programs once the PEP is done. And I think in a way, I mean, you can invoke arguments of effectiveness and impact and the fact that with the same amount of purchases but distributed sort of flexibly over time and across jurisdictions, you can actually achieve a larger impact on overall financing conditions at the euro area level. But interestingly, this argument has a flip side, which is that you can achieve the same impact with a smaller volume of purchases. So if you are concerned about limits to how much central banks can purchase, limits to how much risk they can take on in their balance sheets and so on, you can also invoke the argument of efficiency. You can achieve the same impact with a smaller volume of purchases. So whether you look at it from the point of view of effectiveness, impact, or from the point of view of efficiency, depending on what you are more worried about, either way, you can see that that flexibility has benefits. And therefore, yeah, as I said, my personal preference would be for this flexibility to be incorporated somehow in the future toolkit of the ECB.
Thank you. Giuseppe, do you have anything to add on that?
Yes, maybe I add something that is also referred to something that Lucio was saying before about the fact that monetary policy should be flexible, but sometimes flexibility is not sufficient. So I think that that flexibility is a necessary condition when you implement monetary policy, because if you have an objective, you should reach that objective, conditional obviously to the treaty, to the mandate of the treaty. So, but then you have to reach it without going outside the competence of the central bank. So I think flexibility is important, and I think it should remain in a sense, but again, I repeat, inside the constraints that are given by the treaty. But then let me add also a little thing to what Lucio was saying that has to do a little bit with this. So Lucio was saying, we saw that in a low interest rate environment, fiscal policy, let's say, is very important in order to sustain aggregate demand, let's say, and also to reach price stability. Let me also add something that not only the low interest rate environment was the reason of this important role, it was also because of the nature of the shock that hit the economy with the pandemic crisis. And that kind of shock is very peculiar, is a very highly, let's say, asymmetric shock that hit much harder some sector than other. So in this situation, clearly monetary policy is not the main, let's say, instrument to counteract those situations. This has been shown in many recent works. So, and in this sense, I think flexibility is important, but at the same time, fiscal policy could help in, given the nature of the specific shock, and this I relate also to what Natasha said, that is really important, the nature of the shock. And so flexibility, and at the same time, when there is something that hit very heterogeneously the economy, the main instrument is fiscal.
Yeah. Morgan, do you have anything, you're nodding along with that, and I want to go to Lucio, who we have another question directly for you around that fiscal capacity. But Morgan, do you have anything to add or a different perspective on this? Perhaps? You're on mute currently, to quote the phrase of COVID.
I have one point related to the greening. I mean, there's also this question of incorporating some shades of green in the recovery plans that we see at the EU level, and whether it is a discretionary political choice or whether it's justified for the sake of financial stability. And here the argument that I heard, and which is quite convincing to me, is that you can still continue to follow the line of preventing systemic risk. Because at the end of the day, if you continue this reasoning that climate risk is a source of financial risk, you don't want public money to be used to finance some sectors, which over time will go bust and will require another public bailout. So at the end of the day, I mean, this argument of using public money and target it specifically to green investment does also make sense from a risk perspective. And I mean, from a central bank perspective, if you want to prevent systemic risk over time, it's certainly something that you could support. This is the only point I wanted to make about this fiscal point.
Thank you. I actually want to come into Didier. You had a question. Didier Borowski was on the panel earlier and has a question here. So you can come in with your question directly, which I'm very pleased from Amundi to...
Just a quick question. You have several objectives for monetary policy. On the one hand, we all understand that the ECB will need to finance to some extent the energy and digital transition. On the other hand, what we see is that inflation is back. that inflation expectations at some point might be at risk. And you have also some asset classes asset prices that are very elevated. So don't you believe that at some point the current strategy, you may have some conflict in the objectives? And do you believe that the ECB has fallen in de facto in a kind of fiscal dominance?
Natasha, do you want to take that first, and then I will come round and ask Lucio as well around, do you feel that there is a threat of fiscal dominance? So Natasha first.
Well, I would rephrase that. This is a very good question. I would rephrase that in terms of what has been said more mildly as a way to express the policy mix, you know, the reinforcing forces, the strategic complementarity between fiscal and monetary policy. So while we are in this environment at this, you know, effective lower bound and where there's some asymmetry of effectiveness, then you can still think, okay, the implications for the independence, for the financial independence and the independence of the central bank and the dominance of the system should not, you know, are not imminent concerns. But as a matter of fact, because of an analogous heterogeneity between the valuation of the balance sheet of central banks through the evolution of the value of fixed income assets, in particular sovereign bonds that are sitting there, and the monetary policy instrument, it has to be taken into, it is taken into account. This heterogeneity is taken into account by policymakers. Now, there are accounting, not tricks, but accounting rules that make the balance sheet of the central bank sort of proof to any negative impact on the valuation of their portfolios. But still, the question is there. And I think it is key, again, there was, I was mentioning the ECB symposium. There was also the ECB monetary policy conference last week, where, as you will notice that every year there's someone like Sims coming to speak about it, or and saying, look, you have to be realistic and recognize that something of it is actually de facto happening. So I think the answer is it's a bit the elephant in the room. Now, it's very tricky for a central banker to speak about it in that way. That would be my own subjective interpretation.
Lucio, what are your thoughts? And also, if you do want to touch on the previous question as well, on the flexibility.
I think I prefer to touch on the previous question than on the issue of fiscal dominance, and I leave the colleague from the European System of Central Bank to respond on that. No, there was an interesting and kind of natural question about the development of a central fiscal capacity at EU level, and whether the NGU portends this development. So what I would say, a couple of things. First of all, I mean, the concept of central fiscal capacity unfortunately means different things to different people, and it has been used rather indifferently. And here, for the purpose of, I would just have a very broad distinction between a fiscal capacity that essentially would be a stabilization capacity, so essentially deploying its transfer at the moment when a shock hits, and in order to avoid a ratcheting up of debt at the central level, would also have some mechanism, I mean, to restore balances. There have been many models of that. We have been also working on that. However, I think that the political institutional conditions for this are not ripe. And this is the reason why, when I was speaking before, I preconize perhaps a larger recourse to general escape clauses. Although the first best, many would say, and I would tend to agree with them, would be the development of a stabilization capacity. Then there is another type of fiscal capacity, which is about the provision at the EU level of EU public good, which as a second order has also a stabilizing effect, but is not the way it is conceived. So to some extent, NGU fulfills this mandate, although with many peculiarities. I will just quote two. One is evident, and for some, at least, of the participants, is absolutely crucial. The NGO is an emergency construction. I mean, it's a very complicated legal construction, the basis of which is a recourse of a treaty provision that essentially insists on the emergency condition for this response. So it makes it a bit difficult to institutionalize such a system over time. The second point is that one could criticize the public good characterization because essentially the NGO gives transfer to member states. I mean, it's not about the provision of some public good, or at least not the direct provision, indirectly so, because it contributes to the stability of the overall stability of the EU. So if you were to provoke me on the possible future evolution of NGO, I would say two things. One is banal, the other perhaps is kind of more original. The rather banal thing, I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. So we have to see how NGO will perform. I mean, there are great expectations, but before also you can mobilize the political momentum to go beyond that. So there is a big responsibility on government in the end, because the biggest responsibility is on government on spending this money well, and therefore demonstrate that indeed there is a value added in having such fiscal capacity. The other point is where could be the development of the EU's public good, and here I join the issue of climate change that was discussed from the monetary point of view. I would say that at least if we focus green action on climate change, this is a quintessential public good. I mean, what you do is a EU public good. In fact, it's a worldwide public good. What the country does is not so much for its own interest, but is for the interest of the whole. And therefore, one could imagine possibly a good case for some central fiscal capacity to support the transition to the green economy, especially to support emission abatement. But this would be something different from the stabilization capacity. I think we should be clear about that. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that's quite comprehensive. I think there has been a lot of conversations around the spending well on the next gen EU and how that feeds into the future of it. So I think that's a very interesting point. We have, Giuseppe, I want to come to you for Didier's question. So if you could give a conversation around the fiscal dominance and the role with monetary policy, especially as you look at financing the energy and digital transformation.
So let me go back, yes, to the possibility of fiscal dominance. So I think here, okay, we know that the high level of debt, the higher level of debt, or public and private debt, could complicate the normalization phase of monetary policy. That's clear. However, and here I go back to the nature of the shocks, and now I move not to the pandemic shocks, but to the actual shock on inflation. So, however, for the euro area as a whole, and even more so for Italy, if the exit from the current highly expansionary phase proceed, let's say, in a correct way, that is, when growth is stronger with a higher inflation, obviously, because if not, we are not going to exit. So with growth that is stronger, inflation is higher, and in line with the central bank's objective, the impact of the exit, so on the sustainability of public debt should not be per se a cause of concern. And this is because, in part, because of the long maturity of government debt. So a longer maturity of government debt means that even if you increase now the interest rate, the short-term interest rate, the impact is in impact is not large. So having a sufficiently long maturity of government debt as it is right now, even and the growth. So this is important. This is why it is important to understand if this one is effectively a monetary, a supply or a demand shock, and if it is a supply shock, this could be a large issue to intervene right now with a restrictive monetary policy, because we know that this would say reduce growth also. So this would be the issue. But if this is, and if in the future, when we will have, for sure we will have hopefully some demand shock with a positive shock, in that situation with the structure of government debt, with increasing growth, so even the sustainability of debt shouldn't be a big issue if we have an exit.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that the nature of the shock and the nature of inflation is key to this dynamic. We actually have a question from Xavier, which I want to incorporate with you, Carlos, in answering that question, but also it links to what Giuseppe was saying around the nature of the inflation. So stresses on the supply chains would tend to show there was a lack of understanding of the dynamic and virtual real-time process changes and linking demand off of structural societal changes. So essentially, where does this inflationary shock come from? Is it where the supply chains, the structural societal changes, climate and energy resources, and then also political decisions? So if we've got time at the end, I'm aware that we're sort of 15 minutes in, I want to ask Natasha about the geopolitical landscape as well, with the French election coming up. So we're in a lot of changes, especially within Europe. And what do you consider the bigger threat than temporary inflation? And how does that feed in, Carlos, to the thinking that we have here around the future of the monetary policy toolkit?
Okay, that's a great question. So I guess this question is concerned about scenarios in which high inflation sort of becomes more persistent or quasi-permanent because of let's say more structural factors, factors that go beyond this sort of in principle transitory readjustment between demand and supply as we get out of the pandemic crisis. I mean that's a potential that's an issue to be concerned, certainly. For instance, one risk going forward is that in the transition to this low carbon economy, the transition policies that are implemented to bring that about in terms of carbon taxes and so on might exert an upward pressure on inflation that is long lasting. Okay. Both through the direct impact on energy prices, which would of course raise headline inflation, but also potentially through non-energy prices. So to the extent that these transition policies raise the prices of energy that is used as an input in the production of non-energy goods and services, then of course you may also see persistent upward pressures in core inflation. So through both of these channels, you could have a persistent increase in inflation, and well, that to the extent that translates into medium-term inflation in the euro area being above 2%, then of course this would have monetary policy consequences. But I mean, I won't go beyond that, because we just recognize that this risk is there. But I don't know. Let's see what happens in the coming years on that front.
Absolutely. Morgan, do you have anything to add there? And how would you communicate that to citizens? So what are the structures that you, Banque de France, are trying to put in place to be able to communicate those risks that are potentially more structural to the citizens of Europe?
Yeah, it's maybe just one point to get back to what Scott before. I mean, the impact of climate risk on inflation over time is of course difficult to know. But we had some experience. I know a few years ago, there was this case where because of very heavy drought, the level of the Rhine went down. And because of that, the big boats couldn't go up the river and couldn't deliver the goods to the factories along the Rhine, and because of this, the prices went up. So just to signal that it's quite difficult to know exactly how it's going to work. It could work in both directions. Concerning the point on communicating around inflation, it is very, very difficult. And we experienced this problem also a few years ago when we moved from French franc to the euro, because people had the feeling that at the time, because of the euro, the prices went up. And in practice, we didn't see that in the figures. Why? Because everyone has a number of bias, and when we explain the way the inflation is being measured, then people fail to understand. Typically, of course, there are a number of goods whose price has gone up significantly, but all in all, in the basket, it's not that much. And one typical example of that is your smartphone. I understand, but I'm talking under the control of those who know much better than me. If you buy a new smartphone with new capacities, more memory inside, etc., and if the price stayed the same, then I mean, in terms of inflation, it would be like it would cost a lower price. So even if people pay a little bit higher price for a smartphone, but which met better capacities, I mean, in terms of measuring inflation, it will be reflected as something that costs less because it's measured by megabyte or by amount of memory available. So all of this is difficult to explain to the general audience. We try to do our best. Again, we have a legal responsibility in France on financial literacy. So this is part of our job locally through our network of branches to explain to high school pupils, to explain to the general audience, that sort of things, you know, how we do build our figures for inflation and how you measure it, and why what you feel in your basket is not necessarily what is really happening. But you're right, here this is a clear challenge, and honestly, to be blunt, people do not believe us most of the time. When we go to local branches, they say, no, what you're saying is wrong, but it's not.
I can see that challenge, and I think it goes back to also what we measure within inflation figures as well. I think that's key in communicating how and what those are to get to those numbers. Natasha, part of this communicating to citizens is within the geopolitical world that we operate in. We obviously have the French election coming up and current discussions with the German coalition partners or soon to be partners. And it would be interesting if you could touch on how you feel that central banks, the Commission and national governments are operating within this geopolitical environment. We all like to think that the financial stability is the key element here, and each very intelligent economist is looking at that, but obviously we operate as humans within this world. So it would be very interesting to hear from you, and the questions around climate change being off books to get around the kind of the budgetary considerations for next year. So just a little bit of color and flavor on the geopolitical landscape would be very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in fact, the interesting thing is that we are at a nexus where we see the impact of strong fiscal policy, we see the impact of strong monetary policy, and those elements that are at the core of central bank mandates are also becoming elements in the political debate, in particular in the French context, where the campaign is really starting and pacing up right now. You see that things like price increases, energy prices are a very big element. So we've seen the reintroduction of price caps for energy, for example. So lots of comments around, the fact, should you administer prices more than you do already or less, or is that a sustainable strategy? How long will it last? Is it a way to sort of win votes for the next election? But also discussions in various programs on the evolution of wages in relation to inflation, but not only in relation to inflation, also in relation to perception, which is not always true, by the way, that purchasing power has been eroded with the crisis. And again, with the fiscal intervention, on many metrics that's not been, or at least for many groups of the population, it's not been true. So those elements are really at the core. I think in Germany, the link to the central bank policy is like bread and butter for the whole population. In France, people don't connect things. It's completely And it's fascinating because it's been years now since you've had on the other side of the Rhine, front pages of Bild Zeitung and what have you with central bankers. Well, here, nothing of that. So that's a key element. But I'd like to broaden it a little bit because the topics that are prevailing right now, in particular in the French context, are very much European in nature. For example, the episode of the supremacy of the EU law over national law that was triggered by discussions in Poland and other countries. It's been picked up by populists as proposals. It was really, I see Morgan nodding, but that was really striking that you've seen the proposals saying, well, should national law be subsumed to EU law? So the establishment is trying to extinguish this debate as much as possible, and the majority doesn't think that way. But at the same time, because we see that there's a lot of movement in the political expression of extremes at the moment, that there's the fear that those elements could be opportunistically taken and brought to a too big sort of visibility and center stage in the political debate during the election. So, I mean, concretely, what I'm saying is that we have the emergence in France right now of a weird candidate whose name is Zemmour and who's I mean, standing in the polls is high enough so that we should pay attention to what is said and how this is being, affecting the other extremes that are Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon. So I would say it's on this side of the Rhine, things are just starting, so are far enough from the endpoint so that all those elements are not worrying yet. But they are, volatile enough and large enough in size so that we should really have an eye on it. I think the discussions in Germany at the moment are also make the government in France a bit, on a wait and see mode, like everyone, but also on our side. Also keeping in mind that France will get the presidency of the European Union in January, and the power of proposals will also depend to some degree of the outcome of of the German negotiating process. Even though, I mean, the Franco-German relationship is very strong and central to the way the French think about Europe, but there's also a state of mind which is more open towards other countries, in particular towards Italy, which is very encouraging. And I mean, it's a very subjective view as a former staff member of Mario Draghi, but I think it's the right time to look in this direction and value what's being made there.
Yes, David discussed this earlier in the day around the relationship between France, Germany, and Italy with the respective leaders that will play out in the next sort of 9 months, and how Draghi has such an international standing. So the strength of it, the shifting of the German-French to sort of French-Italian dominance within Europe, and how that will play out over the medium term, I think will be very interesting to watch, and especially for you, Lucio, but also on the ECB and how we come and how the PEP is transferred next year, whether it's extended, whether some of that flexibility is put into other QE programs. But I think that it's been a fascinating and rich discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much for Didier as well and Amundi to put their question. Thank you for Morgan Dupuy, for Giuseppe, for Carlos, for Natasha and Lucio, for all taking the time here to speak with OMFIF and our network. It's been incredibly interesting, I think, and given a lot of detail around the strategy review, the thinking. There is a lot more to come as well around the inflationary debate and where we are in 6 months' time. Is there? We had another question which I apologize I didn't get to, which was talking around the regulation around the cryptocurrencies being a matter of urgency. For in the interest of time, we focused on green and the climate risk, but there is a huge and OMFIF debates it on a frequent basis around the cryptocurrency, and that is a key element to this discussion as well, which Morgan, you talked about too. So I'm so pleased that we're here. Central banks are thinking about this, are communicating with the public here, and thank you all, and thank you to our morning session panelists as well. I'm bringing in David Marsh to close the discussion, so Chairman of OMFIF, but thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Ellie, for taking us through that last session there. And I think the whole question of perception and practice was very prevalent to all of what we had to say in the early stages, as well as this rather granular round that we've just done just now. Difficult to sum up everything, but I just want to make 3 or 4 remarks, really. One was on the whole issue of the geopolitics. We are in a very unstable period, but Europe seems at the moment to be a relatively stable part of this nexus. We know the Pax Americana has come to an end. We're not sure about Russia. We're not sure about China. And yet for the time being, there seems to be some stabilizing forces in Europe. We mentioned Mario Draghi. Very interesting how Riccardo Barbieri brought out the politics straight away here without needing to be tantalized into doing this. There clearly is now an opportunity for Europe to go forward in the next 18 months. There's a new German government likely to be installed possibly towards the end of this year. Probably won't take as long as many people have thought. And I think this is a remarkable opportunity. The fact that Britain isn't part of the European Union and has also been offering up some negative examples of what happens if you leave, that's been a stabilizing factor as well. One has to say it wouldn't have been possible to put the Next Generation Fund to wraps and put that into operation had Britain still been there. I'm not in favor of leaving the European Union, but I think you could say that this has been a positive negative factor on Europe. The issue is, though, how long will this last? I think there is a time race going on because sooner or later there will have to be higher interest rates. Very interesting to have the debate on inflation as well this morning. Seems to be general consensus that this inflation spike will be transitory, but everybody is in some doubt about all this. Communications, that came up a lot with your session just now. Also, I like the fact, Natasha, you said, which you said before, of course, that in France, people just take central banking for granted, whereas in Germany, they really get quite, they get very, very interested in this, and they're interested in the small print. But of course, the German people at the moment haven't been getting vexed about high inflation, even though it's gone up now to 3 or 4%, which is high by relatively recent standards. That maybe is a sign of a kind of normalization in Germany, or perhaps it's just the calm before the storm. As you said before, Natasha, nobody could care less about the Target 2 system in France, whereas in Germany, it's almost like the subject of conversations you have with people on bus stops. You know, it's much more of an interesting question. I happen to think myself that communication is not something that you can do in very down-to-earth language. I don't believe you can make monetary policy explicable for the man or woman in the street. I know that sounds a bit elitist, but I think it is a complicated question, and therefore is really something for page 36 of Le Monde rather than for the front pages of the Bild Zeitung. But of course, it does get onto the front pages of the Bild Zeitung. I think there's a huge danger, and this was brought up, I think it was Morgan who said this, that the world at large thinks that central banks are responsible for almost everything, and therefore you're going to get a lot of blame if things go wrong. And it's not just climate change, it's not just banking supervision. It was brought up before, I believe, about the importance of trying to maintain living standards and trying to maintain purchasing possibilities at a time when inflation is going up. So there is a danger, I think, that a lot of faults and a lot of negative effects will be brought to the door of the central banks. And one's got to be very recognizing of this peril. A lot of talk about the fiscal monetary coordination, a lot of talk about the problems which happened last time before and also after the crisis of 2008, 2009 of tightening too early. Christine Lagarde was given almost like a vote of thanks this morning for having recognized this. But of course, there are some dangers in this, quotes, fiscal monetary coordination, end quotes, that the central banks could get a little bit too dependent on the politicians, and the politicians, of course, get too dependent on the central banks. There's a danger, I think, of an overcloying interdependence. I don't like the word independence. I don't think central banks are properly independent, but I think central banks should certainly be autonomous, and therefore guarding the autonomy of the central bank, guarding your sort of chasse gardée is going to be very important against the politicians, who will both be using you for areas where they don't feel competent or they don't feel themselves to have all the right answers, but they will also be blaming you when things go wrong, as they assuredly will. So I think we're in a relatively sweet spot at the moment in Europe, but maybe we've got 18 months or 24 months to ride ourselves out of this and to get some really good positive solutions going, including in this area of greenification. We must mention Robert Raffaele as well, who felt that the process of standardization of some of these green instruments, he felt would take a good step forward by the end of next year. I think it was very good that Robert started off the discussion with this excellent talk about regulatory environment. There was a lot of talk about various acronyms there and a lot of new words that we have to try to remember, but it's all very, very important that he's given a new impetus, I think, to the Capital Markets Union, rather from the bottom up rather than the top down. So a lot of responsibility for the new German government. We may well get some more news on that tomorrow. The Germans go about these things in a rather slow way. There's a pre-sounding and then a sounding, and only then do you actually have the coalition talks. But we could be that we'll be at the beginning of the end of the first phase, and it could well be we'll have this unlikely three-cornered combination in Germany under the rather serious leadership of Mr. Scholz, and that could be there before Christmas. So I'd like to join Ellie in thanking everybody for being here, and thank you for our excellent panel of discussants, both before and after the break. And we look forward to getting together in a proper roundtable and a proper table somewhere in Europe over the next few months. And Ellie will be in charge of putting that all together. I do hope we can see you all there, whether it's going to be in Rome or Berlin or Paris or Frankfurt or one of the other countries, or maybe even London, if we can get people to cross the channel or cross the North Sea and come to London. So we look forward to that. Thank you very much indeed for the very open-minded and generous spirits of conversation and dialogue that we've had. And we've genuinely learned things from each other today, which is the whole point of the exercise. So thank you everybody for being part of it. And we look forward to the next time round. Goodbye, everybody.